Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, and welcome to this dissemination webinar of the SLOCAT Transport and Climate Change Global Status Report in its second edition. It's really a pleasure being here with all of you, as actually the world is still assessing the impact of this pandemic, and perhaps it is time for all of us, to assess to what extent the development patterns we are following, including on transport demand, transport financing and access, are really putting us in line with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on climate change. We know that the pandemic has had a significant impact on the emissions from our transport sector, around a 19% of reductions on CO2 emissions. But at the same time, we know that it is roughly equal to what will be needed in terms of reducing emissions from our sector in order to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement by 2050. And that it's because the transport emissions are really presenting serious challenges, because the transport sector continues to be the fastest growing source of global CO2 emissions. A better understanding of the specific sources of these transport emissions and how to address them is critical. And it is precisely to address this knowledge gap that we put together this SLOCAT Transport and Climate Change Global Status Report. In its second edition, it is telling us the global and regional stories of where we are and where we need to get to urgently on climate action in the transport sector. As you can see from the video, it's been really a community effort, an effort where we have managed to leverage the entirety of the SLOCAT partnership. The report has really gathered over 150 global experts, world-class experts, and really our warmest thanks to all of them and to everybody who has contributed to shaping this report. And thanks in particular to the financial supporters from Germany's GIZ and the French Agency for Development. It's been really our honor to have the opportunity of putting this together, thanks to everybody's support. What we are trying to do in this webinar, next slide please, is of course to socialize the key findings and the messages of the report and take the opportunity of amplifying this analysis to start generating conversations amongst our community and also our community and others related to renewables, to urban sustainability, to health, behavioral change, and so on. What we're going to do in the next few minutes is try to present to you some of the key findings from the report, its different sections, and then take you through a quick tutorial on the website that is dedicated to the report, so you can actually use all its resources and make them yours and really access the open source data and materials that are behind them. We are then going to move into a panel discussion where we're going to be honored with the participation of several of the authors, contributors, strategy team members, financial supporters who have made this report possible. And at different moments, we really want to hear from you, our participants. There'll be an opportunity for questions and answers after the team presents the key findings of the report, and a second opportunity for questions and answers after the panel discussion has taken place. With that, we have actually exhausted the 90 minutes we had dedicated planned for this webinar, and we would be moving on to a short wrap up with some announcements and leave you to continue with other commitments of your day. So with no further ado, we're going to move now to this presentation of key findings of the report by the SLOCAT Secretariat team. But before doing that, let's move on to the next slide and let's make sure that you are there, participants. We really want to break a bit the ice here, and we would like you to ask. We would like to ask you to please pick up your phones, any device, your computers, your phones. Go into www.menti.com, enter that code, and help us break a bit the ice. We're going to be generating a cloud of words, and we want to see what are the key trends that come to your mind when you think about the interface between climate and transport. This is an opportunity for us to sort of break the ice, be a bit more interactive, and then you will see to what extent many of the things that cross your mind hopefully are going to be resonating with the key findings of the report. So come on, let's get started. Participants, let's go therefore to menti.com, use that code, and to the magical hands in the back helping from the SLOCAT Secretariat, let's display that word cloud so we can see what is being generated on the go. We're going to dedicate just a few minutes to this, of course, because it's never easy, isn't it? We cannot give it 10 minutes, but the idea there, it's starting to populate. Okay, brilliant. What is coming? Electromobility there at the center, inequality equally at the center. Excellent. Travel demand management and demotorization, active mobility. Subs, you know, that source of CO2 emissions, absolutely. Cycling there at the very end. Freight as well, excellent that we are not just talking transport, passenger transport, but also freight, because the report covers both. And I see that many of the themes that are emerging here are covered in the report, either through the thematic lenses that we use or through some of the focus features where we tackle actually cross-cutting issues of importance. What else is popping up there? Shift, indeed, avoid, shift, improve, that framework, that hierarchy of strategies that is as important as ever, isn't it, to take us towards a holistic transformation of our transport and mobility systems. Phenomenal. We can see your brains are active. This is great. We can see the resonance with what we're going to try to cover today. I'm going to give it perhaps a few more seconds in case anything changes in that cloud. Not seeing much movement. Freight is actually picking up a lot of centrality there. Of course, we've seen to what extent the demand on freight transport has been increasing over the years, isn't it? And with the effects of the pandemic on e-commerce is only going even higher and higher and higher, of course, coupled with the global supply chains that still remain extremely globalized. So I can understand well why you're putting freight so much at the center. Informal transport has made it. That is terrific, because the report is also trying to focus on those paratransit services that are so essential in many cities of the global south. So with no further ado, and because the clock is ticking, I'm going to ask the team to take us back, please, to the master presentation that we are using, and I'm going to pass it on to the Secretariat team, the Secretariat of the SLOCAT Partnership, to introduce to you some of the key findings. This is going to be a shared presentation by many different people in the team. You're going to hear from Carl Pete and also from Angel Cortez and from Angela Enriquez, from Emily Josek, from Nicola Medimorech, and from Alice Yu. And all of them, they're going to give you a quick tour on some of the key findings and a quick tutorial on how to maximize the benefits of that dedicated website. So there we go. Over to you, team, please.
Greetings, everyone. It is my pleasure to present an overview of the executive summary. The summary begins with an overarching and critical question. What is at stake for climate action in the transport sector in a post-pandemic world? And as we've all experienced, the past 2 years have left a lasting mark on both human and planetary history. Despite the dramatic impact of transport demand due to the pandemic, we find that transport emissions are still not moving in the right direction. And while the pandemic has stressed the need for bold action and increased ambition from policymakers, recovery packages so far have been a mixed bag for climate action on transport. And so we conclude that accelerating radical action on transport is crucial for a green and equitable recovery, and of course, to meet ambitious Paris Agreement targets, as well as achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The summary next outlines some of the major threats, opportunities, and uncertainties for climate action in transport at this historic moment. Among the threats are continued trends toward rising transport emissions. We find a general lack of resilience planning for transport, and we see continued subsidies of fossil fuels. We also see a number of opportunities for decarbonization in the transport sector, which include increasing targets for phasing out internal combustion engines and phasing in electric vehicles of many types. We see falling battery prices, which are allowing the scale up of e-bikes and e-buses worldwide. And we've witnessed open streets in more than 200 cities, or very near to 200 cities, that have allowed millions to reimagine their daily mobility patterns. As we continue to move through the pandemic, we're faced with a number of uncertainties, and these include whether or not recovery packages will be effectively and accountably deployed, and whether public transit and when public transport will regain its ridership with increasing trends toward remote work and a number of other factors. And so the summary concludes that in anticipating these threats and uncertainties, we can more effectively capitalize on the emerging opportunities. The summary then takes a brief tour of various thematic trends from A to Z, which are previewed in the summary and detailed in the main report. And I'll touch on just a few of these here. First, looking at access to transport, the summary notes that the majority of urban residents in the Global South lack convenient access to essential jobs and services, something that must be addressed for effective climate action. We note that gender-sensitive planning is critical to removing barriers to sustainable mobility access for girls and women worldwide. And we see that intercity passenger transport continues to increase in demand and emissions and is an increasing contributor to emissions in the transport sector, due again to fossil fuel subsidies and a number of other car-friendly policies in recent years. And so the summary underscores that these promising and challenging trends in these and other areas will establish the future direction and impact of sustainable low-carbon transport. The summary closes with another overarching and critical question. Where do we go from here to achieve more equitable transport trajectories? And taking radical action as an imperative, the summary frames these 4 building blocks to harness momentum on climate action. Tackling major threats to transport climate action will require raising both mitigation and adaptation ambition in NDCs, in long-term strategies, and delivering on these ambitions. Scaling up opportunities will require mobilizing an unprecedented set of funding streams, especially in emerging economies. Responding to uncertainties will require learning and applying lessons from the pandemic to build more stable and resilient transport systems. And finally, strengthening the transport community will require establishing strategic collaborations across sectors. So while the past years have unveiled a number of substantive threats, they've also set a stage to transform this time of uncertainty into a moment of opportunity. And with that, I'd like to pass the mic to my colleague, Angel Cortez, who will kick off a discussion of key findings from the main body of the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl, and hi, everyone. I'm Angel, and I'll be now presenting on section 1 of the report, which covers global transport and climate change. As of 2018, transport makes up 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions and 24% of energy-related CO2 emissions. As you can see here, passenger road transport still dominates the share of transport emissions. However, the share of freight transport has grown to now make up 40%. And this is mostly due to the rising demand for consumer goods and their delivery. With freight transport's growing demand, it's important to consider the large challenge of decarbonization due to both the lack of comprehensive policies as well as lack of zero emission options for freight. In the last 2 decades, as shown here, from 2000 to 2019, there's been a consistent overall increasing trend in transport CO2 emissions. Most notably, the Asia region saw the highest growth in transport emissions with an increase of 41%. This was followed by the Africa region, where emissions increased by 27%, and then the Oceania region, where emissions increased by 13%. Europe did, however, decrease its transport emissions by 2% during this time. There's also been a high increase in emissions from international aviation and shipping, where both saw double-digit growth. Aviation emissions increased by 37% and shipping increased by 10%. As the region with the highest growth of transport emissions, we'll take a look at Asia as an example of the increasing trends of car ownership and transport CO2 emissions. Shown here on the left side of the graphic, within 2005 to 2015, Asia's car ownership rate increased 87%, which is more than 3 times the global average. Elaborating on Asia's 41% increase in transport emissions on the right side of the graphic, 2/3 of Asian countries also exceeded the global average for transport emissions growth. With the alarmingly consistent and increasing rate of growth in transport emissions, more than ever do we need to integrate and leverage avoid, shift, and improve strategies, also known as ASI, into transport policy and planning. More importantly, we should prioritize avoid and shift strategies since evidence finds that they can account for a large portion of transport emissions reductions at a lower cost in comparison to improved strategies. This would mean focusing on strategies such as transit-oriented development, parking management, intermodal freight transport as opposed to improving vehicle design and efficiency or integrating renewable energy. You will be able to find more comprehensive examples of ASI strategies within our report. And I'll now hand it over to my colleague Nicola Medemeric, who will be presenting on section 2.
Okay, thank you very much. I will now briefly present on some key findings of section 2, transport demand, emissions and targets. Transport CO2 emissions rose by over 17% in the last decade, which means it was the fastest growing fossil fuel combustion sector. As you can see in the chart, the growth of transport was very linear and more consistent than for any other of the sectors, also indicating the urgency that we are facing right now. Overall, transport is, together with other industrial combustion, the second highest emitter of man-made CO2 emissions. Next, looking at developments by transport modes, we can see that road transport, passenger and freight is by far the largest driver of transport demand and emissions in the past years. 3/4 of transport emissions are caused by road transport. Actually, and this chart here is from the first section of the report, but still it reflects very well all the transport modes and services that are outlined and discussed in the second section regarding the demand and their emission trajectory. So, for example, like road transport, intercity travel, aviation, and shipping. A major issue of transport decarbonization is that, for example, in road transport, the efficiency gains through better vehicle technology are being outweighed by the rising preference for larger personal vehicles. So sports utility vehicles, or SUVs as they're called, have become increasingly popular, and they're actually a major reason for emission growth in the past decade. The chart shows how the SUV, or the share of SUVs sold, has doubled or tripled in some major economies over the past years. For transport decarbonization, it is important to enable economic prosperity while mitigating transport emissions. The SLOCAT Transport and Climate Change Global Stats Report looks at the decoupling of transport emissions and GDP growth. For now, early signs of decoupling can be found in OECD member countries, especially since the year 2007. However, for non-OECD member countries, transport CO2 emissions are growing at a larger intensity than GDP, but both of these aspects are still growing. Overall, additional structural changes are needed to further decouple economic growth and transport emissions. The COVID-19 pandemic had significant impacts on transport emissions, leading to the strongest reductions among all sectors. Transport emissions in 2020 were nearly 20% below 2019 levels, or in other words, 1.5 gigatons below 2019 levels. Sales of new passenger vehicles also dropped around 14%. The chart shows that the strongest reductions have been between the months of April and June of 2020. I pass it now to my colleague, Angela Enriquez, for the next part of the presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Angela Enriquez, and I will be covering Section 3, Responses to Address Climate Change in the Transport Sector. Section 3 has 10 major thematic areas, the ones that you see here, and I wanted to just quickly thank all of the contributing authors for their support in developing these sections. So I'm just going to briefly go over some of the key findings that you can find within Section 3. First of all, just wanted to highlight that the transport sector continues to be heavily dependent on fossil fuels. In 2018, about 95% of the energy in the transport sector came from fossil fuels. The same year, there was a slight increase of usage of renewables within the sector. However, there's still a long way to go. In terms of demand trends for public transport systems have continued to grow within the past 10 years, led by strong growth in Asia and Latin America. And you can see from the graphics below where the trends have happened by region in terms of the major public transport system types. And then in regards to other sustainable transport modes, it would just be good to highlight that walking and cycling is estimated to be a feasible substitute for about 40% of short car trips. This could save nearly 5% of CO2 emissions from car travel on top of the estimated 5% of avoided emissions from current walking and cycling trips. This slide shows that high-speed rail has arrived in more countries. However, the majority of the growth in high-speed rail development is still focused in China and in Europe. In terms of growth of electric mobility, it very much accelerated in 2020. The global stock of electric passenger cars grew by 40%, surpassing the 10 million mark. And as you can see in the graphic to the left, most of the global stock is in China, which accounts for 46% of the electric passenger car stock share. And in terms of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, public transport ridership was very much impacted with a decrease of about 90% globally between March and August of 2020. However, due to expanded access to improve walking and cycling infrastructure, there were many projects that were implemented in more than 250 cities that increased mobility at the local level. And again, these are just some of the examples that you can find within section 3. There's so many more, so please refer to the report to find out more on many of the other topics that are presented within the 10 thematic areas. And with that, I will give it to my colleague Emily to cover section 4.
Thank you, Angela. My name is Emily Hosek, and I'll be taking you through a quick look at the current financial situation for achieving climate action in transport outlined in section 4 of the report. So first of all, there are significant financing gaps to achieving low carbon transport pathways. Globally, investments in the order of US $2.7 trillion are needed annually from 2016 to 2030, with 60 to 70% of these investments needed in emerging economies. Looking at urban mobility in particular, to reduce overall urban emissions, of which transport makes up a significant amount, an estimated US $1.83 trillion is needed annually. And these investments would, however, yield significant savings in the future through reduced climate impacts in the order of nearly $7 trillion in the year 2050. Right now, we're also at a very important and opportune moment to invest in sustainable low carbon transport, with the COVID-19 pandemic leading to a low yield environment in 2020, making transport infrastructure assets even more attractive to investors. Investments are not needed at the same levels everywhere. There are significant regional investment gaps for transport, particularly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean. An important factor for sustainable transport is that globally, 88% of roadways do not meet minimum walking safety requirements, and 86% do not meet minimum cycling safety requirements. This is particularly pronounced in Africa, where more than 9 out of 10 streets don't meet these minimum safety requirements. So major investments are needed to make our streets safer for pedestrians and cyclists and incentivize these low carbon modes. Of the current money being spent on transport, the majority, 66%, is going towards road transport, followed by much less significant investments in rail, airports, and ports. In OECD member countries, transport infrastructure spending grew 7% annually on average between 2010 and 2017, with significant growth in spending on both roads and air travel. The transport sector is a major global employer, and the investments that we need to fill the significant financing gap will create many new jobs. Transport investments in walking and cycling infrastructure and electric vehicle charging infrastructure in particular hold the highest potential to multiply employment opportunities. Now, looking at some of the most recent financing streams through COVID-19 recovery packages, unfortunately, we're seeing only around a third of transport investments associated with clean transport, and these are being far outweighed by fossil fuel-focused investments. These current COVID-19 recovery packages are very large and they dwarf existing low-carbon investments. Using only a fraction of these recovery packages could put the world on track towards decarbonization by 2050. So it's important for the global community to continue pushing to include more sustainable transport measures in recovery funding. There have, however, been some important subnational commitments in this area. For example, in September 2020, the mayors of a diverse group of global cities committed to divesting from fossil fuel companies with the explicit aim of promoting a green and just pandemic recovery. So that was just a very quick summary of some of the major findings you can find in section 4 of the TCC GSR. And as always, we encourage you to check out the full report. So I will now pass the floor on to my colleague Alice, who will show you how to use the report website and other materials. Thank you.
So by now you probably will realize that this report is very ambitious and very big. So we wanted to give you a quick tutorial on how to use the website and maximize the report materials and data. The report takes a modular approach. So while the report can be downloaded as a single file and read from start to the finish, sections of interest can also be accessed individually through our website. So we really encourage you to take a look at our website, which is very interactive, and you'll be able to find that the report is divided into 5 main sections. The sources of the information provided are listed at the end of each section, and cross-references among sections are included. The executive summary summarizes the report trends and conclusions, and it highlights the threats, opportunities, and uncertainties for climate action in the transport sector. The remaining sections highlight key findings on transport demand, emissions, policy measures, and COVID-19 pandemic impacts. Additionally, 7 focus features put a spotlight on the important cross-cutting issues. Moreover, 31 country fact sheets were developed for countries that had the highest absolute transport carbon dioxide emissions in 2019. So these fact sheets present data on transport demand, emission trends, and measures taken at the national level. The data used in the report were collected from primary sources, conducted through a network of national focal points to ensure greater diversity of data and policies from a broader set of regions. And these data shared by national focal points are compiled in the SLOCAT Transport Knowledge Base, or we call it the TRACK-B database, which is published together with the report, making the publicly available data accessible to readers and policymakers. You can find all of these information from our website and also from the report itself. So now we'll turn over the time back to Maruxa. Thank you.
Thanks very much, team, for that quick tour on the key findings and on the website. We hope participants that you have enjoyed some of these and that hopefully it becomes a food for thought for all of us to be able to continue the conversation in the coming months. This is the opportunity really to hear a bit from you. Alice is going to help us conduct some of the question and answer. We already have a question from Sudhir, isn't it, Alice? So over to you, Alice.
That's right. Thank you so much, Maruxa, and also thank you so much, Sudhir, for your great question. So I'm going to read it here one more time for those who haven't seen it. Sudhir has a question that says that, so in the report, it was quoted, temporary reduction in the transport emissions in 2020 roughly equals to the reduction needed annually to meet 2050 targets. So considering 2 gigatons in 2050, it is about 4% annual reduction from 2020. Does SLOCAT consider a different target for transport? So I was thinking perhaps Carl or Nicola from our team would be able to share some thoughts on this, and Tali as well, since you co-authored sections on emissions and the low carbon pathway. So if you guys would like to share any response to Sudhir.
Thank you, Alice. I'm happy to jump in and, of course, invite my colleagues to make any additions to the comments. Again, wonderful question, Sudhir. And just to put to the group, we're drawing from the UNEP emissions gap report, and we're assuming a target of between 2 and 3 gigatons by 2050, knowing that that's a number still under development, but we are also taking into account the ongoing business as usual projections and potential rebound effects for both the aviation the aviation sector, the shipping sector, and of course, looking at continued strong growth from intercity transport. And so that's where we're coming from in this part of the report. And I would again invite Tali or Nicola to add any further thoughts there as relevant.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Just one more point here, that kind of the emission data that we are, like the CO2 emission data that we are showing in the report, and until 2019 is different than what we are showing for 2020, and with impact on COVID-19. So it's still not fully clear how big the impact of COVID-19 was, how big the emission reductions were for the transport sector and for all other sectors. So we still have to wait until a couple of months from now to get like the really final data that gives us for the full times used in full years. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you, Nicola. Tali, I know we called on you, but it's okay. You don't have to if you don't want to. I don't see a hand, so we would move on to another quick question, unless Tali, you want to tell me that right now. But I've got a question actually from social media, and it actually asked, what surprised us the most about the GSR daytime findings? Now, this is a bit more general, but it's a very big report. So I'm sure there must be some sort of findings that would interest you for good and for bad. So if anybody has any questions or any answers from the team, anything that surprised you in the findings?
I can briefly touch on one finding, and it was one that I actually presented, and that was about the usage of renewables in the transport sector, considering how much electrification is ramping up. Our share, the transport sector share, is still really low in terms of renewable energy. So I think this is something that hopefully we're starting to learn more about within the sector, is that when we're talking about and considering and looking at switching towards electrification, it is done with also switching toward renewables in mind. So that is something that I thought was really interesting, that the share of renewables is still relatively low, considering how much attention electrification within the sector is getting.
Thank you, Angela, for your quick answer. I got a question also from Bronwyn, and she's asking if there are any significant differences between this edition and the first edition in either the impacts or the actions being taken in the transport sector. So any particular differences that we see in the trends as well, or perhaps Carl, would you like to take this one as well?
Yes, thanks, Alice. And of course, as we know, 2020 was an unusual year that helped to kind of throw a wrench in all the trends that we've seen. And so it's a great question, and I think a challenging question as we navigate this, this new world coming toward us, and the post-pandemic views. I think I'll raise one point, and again invite colleagues to contribute others. I think something that we would like to see more of, we're seeing a slight shift in trends. So I'd like to talk briefly about this second generation of NDCs that have been released and are continuing to appear as we make our way toward COP26. We're seeing, I think a very slight uptick in targets for the transport sector, mitigation targets, and of course carbon emissions targets, as well as some more indirect targets of scaling up electric vehicle use and making that a larger share, of course, of new vehicle sales. So that's something that we're seeing it shift, but we really need to see it shift more in order to make the targets come through. And I think also, yeah, there are some really booming trends, some of which have been touched upon. For instance, with e-bikes really scaling up and really prepared, or really poised, I should say, to go through the roof. And so it's exciting to see that electric vehicles, electrification is not focused strictly on four-wheel personal vehicles, but also a broader set of vehicle types, including, again, e-bikes and e-buses. So I think these are important trends and changes that we're seeing from the last report, and as mentioned, would invite further comment from my colleagues.
Thank you, Cara. I think you actually gives a very good summary and a very good glimpse about what this report is offering. And actually, in the interest of time, I think Maruxa, do you think we should pass it back to you now for the panel discussion?
I see Tally on my screen coming up, and because we put him on the spotlight, let's give him a few seconds or a few minutes. Tally, please, if you want, please go ahead. I have a few comments of my own, but come on, Tally, please.
Yeah. Sure, happy to. No, I think Carl and Nicola covered the topic quite well. Thank you, Sudhir, and everyone for the questions. Very happy to be here. I think it was quite interesting to dig into data and to try to understand what the COVID impact was in the middle of it, which is a bit of an impossible task, of course, but then we had to try to look forward and see how it would evolve. Also, which were other trends that were already happening that were now accelerated. From my native country, there was Flygskam, as in the sort of behavioral move towards moving against a bit of flying, moving towards more trains and night trains. And I think that was quite an interesting trend, and we'll see if that remains. Indications are it has. I think the one thing that, let's say, surprised me a lot in the report, and I think one thing that really ties it together, is the topic of urban freight, I guess is one way to put it, which ties in a bit of everything: COVID-19, delivery, the amount of goods that are moved within cities, the interest then of, or the value proposition of electrifying electric 2- and 3-wheelers, as well as delivery vans. So I think the topic of freight has been sort of increasing in significance, which is good, but also now finally attention. And I think now that we're kind of looking at cities also, it really, and with COVID-19, it's a nice way to kind of wrap it all together. So I think that was one of the, let's say, key themes that was interesting in the report. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Tally, and thanks, Alice. If I can just throw in a couple of thoughts from myself, on the questions. There was a key figure that actually, made me go like, really? That figure that says that just a fraction of the money that it's being right now mobilized for the recovery packages could actually put us on the right track for the right type of transport and mobility we need. So it's not necessarily lack of money as we know it, but it's directing the money to those type of investments we need in that avoid, shift, and improve hierarchy of strategy. So to me, that was very telling. The money is being rolled out. Let's use it correctly. It's really now or never. And in terms of comparing this second edition to the first edition a couple of years ago, indeed what Tali was saying, but to me was also the sustainable urban mobility plans, the SUMPs, that were so much centric to the European region, how much we are seeing it now getting expanded in Latin America and in Africa. That is great news, because it means that there is a concerted effort, isn't it, to have a multi-stakeholder, a multi-level governance plan for the mobility and transport of cities in the global south, in Latin America and in Africa. Of course, the figures about the open street movements, to what extent almost 200 cities around the world have experienced, experimented almost with reclaiming public space since we gave it entirely to the car in the last century. That for me was also a very interesting point. And somehow linked to that, if you want, the increased number of jurisdictions at the national level or subnational level, and automakers making announcements to phase out internal combustion engines. I think that has been a significant difference compared to the first edition, and it puts us on an interesting track, isn't it? That accelerates aspects that perhaps we didn't think would get so accelerated a couple of years ago only. So these are a few of my thoughts, but of course, the beauty of this webinar is that now we go into a panel discussion that is going to be facilitated by Branwen Thornton. Branwen is the chair of the board of directors of SLOCAT, and also, of course, the CEO of Walk21. She's been one of the members of the strategy team behind the report, and she's going to be conducting a bit of a conversation amongst different colleagues who have all been part and parcel very centrally of the elaboration. May I ask all the members of the panel to please go on their cameras while the Secretariat team puts the cameras off, and that way we know who is actually speaking. Might be easier for everyone. Thank you very much. Over to you, Bron.
Great. Thank you so much, Maruxa. Hello and welcome everybody to this discussion, especially my esteemed panelists. And for those who may not be able to catch all their names on the screen, just welcome Tali Trigg, Holger Dolkman, Carolina Chantrill, Madan Regni, Stefan Karkas, and Friedel Schiller to the conversation. And we're going to take what we've heard already, and we're going to look forwards. And I must admit that question that I put to the previous group was a little bit of a setup, because for some of us who are amongst this group, not only have you been deeply and intimately involved in generating this report and bringing it to fruition, but you were also involved in the first edition, as was I. And we know not only the amount of work that's required to bring it together, but we are in touch with seeing how this knowledge base is evolving and expanding and riching up as these reports are developed over time. So we're going to be taking a look forward. We have a couple of questions for a discussion amongst ourselves, and in looking at the trends that we've heard and thinking about what are the key actions, where do we prioritize? We've heard already some of the shifts that have come about with both from the first to the second edition, but also with that injection of the COVID pandemic into the global paradigm of how we think about our commitments. And I've heard some fantastic things there. We've heard about increasing targets. We've heard about increasing e-mobility, especially for two wheels, and improvements in freight. But where do you, as people intimately involved in this conversation, what do you think are the next priority actions? And we always talk about the word accelerate. We have to keep accelerating. We have to accelerate investment and action. So perhaps I'll jump first to Holger and take your views on this. And then panelists, please, I'm happy to call you to the table, but if somebody is saying something that you immediately want to follow on with, then please do take yourself off mute and join us, or put your hand up during the conversation. Over to you. Oh, and just one last thing before I do go to Holger, sorry, is we are going to have a few minutes for questions at the end. So please drop your questions into the chat as well for this session. Thanks, Holger.
Thanks, Bronwyn, and hi, everyone from good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Big thanks first also to SLOCAT for inviting me, but also congrats also to the team for an excellent report. And I would actually really start with, we need to repeat again and again, we need the radical action towards an equitable decarbonization of transport. So that's also like wheelers repeat again and again, or go there, transport is also key. And we heard about more than a decade ago, Eva de Boer said, if we cannot tackle transport, we cannot tackle climate. I would actually even also go further, saying if we don't tackle transport, we ruin our climate, we ruin the future of the next generation. And I think that also has to be spoken out loud and clear, and that report also came really loud and clear about that. Three things briefly also, which I would also consider. First of all, we saw also in the Mentimeter, we all love urban mobility. And sorry, Bronwyn, walking is core, is key, but please also let also wheelers have all subsectors. We see also the massive increases in freight. We also have also the aviation part, and we also have the interurban passenger transport. And numbers say clearly, if we focus just with our strategies on urban mobility, we not get anywhere near. So here we need also far more also the attention in the freight sector, in the aviation, challenges of that sector. Where are also the ITDPs, the WIs, the other great groups also challenge that? Obviously, we have TNE and others going there, but it seems also that there needs to be a far stronger voice also in that. So let's pay attention to that. Secondly, also the report, and was nicely presented, there is not one solution for the planet. We have different regions, we have different economics, we have different policies there, we have a different mobility culture, and really also getting that. Australia needs solution on aviation first to see that. We have landlocked countries also struggling also with freight access. We have also New Zealand coming up with a wonderful balance also as I approach towards decarbonization. But can we also have that in Cambodia and Namibia also at that time? Or we need also them also to have the economic growth, and Carl presented also the need for decoupling, but we are also not there. So these are for me also elements as we have to far more into that. We need national strategies, very detailed basis on data, and also on linking also to the economy. And that's also just my last one. Let's get the transport policies right. We even also not have also the NDCs transport not play that role, because also of often also it's even also not really many people in the transport ministry are even aware of that. So let's have first a transport policy, and then there's an economic policy, and then also let's get us into the NDC and bring us that together. So that's for me also the key thing. We also, as we talked and as started also with, let's talk more about also freight. We also have to think about the green manufacturing. We have to think about also green jobs, but also how our economy can actually look like in the future with also this massive growth, and how we also cope with that also with on transport. Thanks, Bronwyn. I pause here. I know there are 5 other panelists. I can go on about this wonderful report forever.
I think that's great, Holger, because you touched on the regional differences and the sector differences. And this report puts everything in the same place in a way that makes it very apparent that those differences will matter in the choices that people make about those solutions. Stefan, maybe I can go to you next. Your thoughts on what are the key priorities for actions in light of what we've seen in the report?
Yeah, thank you very much to all of you. I hope you can hear me. First of all, perhaps thanks to SLOCAT team. We in AFD are partnering with you since 5 or 6 years, I think, and we are very happy to do that. And this year also we contributed with my colleague Suzanne to your report, and we are very happy to do that. First, perhaps 4 main messages for me. Of course, many things have already been said, but first, perhaps to say something about AFD. Basically speaking, AFD, it's 1 billion transport financing each year, and of course, climate and SDGs achievements are the core mantra of our agenda. For every project, it's compulsory for us to develop. We have developed some tools to calculate GHG reduction emissions, and it's compulsory for us to do that for every project, and not only in transport. Perhaps also a word on the importance of mitigation, of course, but also on adaptation, especially in rural mobility. For example, we are financing rural mobility transport projects. Adaptation is key. It would be my first message. The second one, of course, we all mention the EASY international framework. Perhaps usually we are more focusing on ASI, improve, shift, and avoid. But of course, we have also to focus on the E. The E is enable, is governance. And this is leading to my third message. Thank you, Maruxa. You mentioned the SUMPs, the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans, and I think it's the core, one of the core area of action for AFD, thanks to European Union and to our colleagues of GIZ, and I think it's key. And I would just pick up some buzzwords on some perhaps. Of course, financing SUMPs we are focusing on climate impacts, of course, but I think if we want transport to really be decarbonized, we have to make so that these programming actions are tackling everybody, including the most vulnerable people. So we have to put also social issues in these programming actions. We have to deal perhaps not only in the capital cities, where we were perhaps some years ago, but also in secondary cities. Perhaps it's a key thing to do. For example, today, if this is financing, I would say some SUMPs in Boaké, in Africa, in Ivory Coast, or in Santos, in Brazil, in Arequipa, in Peru. So let us tackle also secondary cities. And so, as I said just before, not only talking on climate, some just buzzwords. First is these SUMPs are participative. We have to make the people participate to the process so that they can endorse and propose solutions. Of course, we all mentioned non-motorized transport, pedestrian, cycling, to tackle vulnerable peoples, to talk on gender, to develop gender action plans when it's relevant, to talk on road safety, to talk on fair transition, transport fare structure, paratransit, of course, social impacts of transport reforms, jobs creation. I think this is also a part of the job.
Great.
Well, my last message perhaps would be, what are the stakes today? Of course, it's to continue these SUMPs, but also, of course, to implement projects. So since decades, we are implementing urban transport projects. I would focus perhaps on, well, some specific issues. The first one is electric mobility. We all mention electric mobility. My feeling is that, well, things are engaged in Latin America. We have to push again and to support our partners, but something has begun. Same thing in Asia, of course. The stake perhaps is to think on Africa. We all know that the energy sector perhaps have more constraints in Africa, but probably we have to, I think we have energy people around the table. And my message would be, let us work together. We need the energy guys to improve the energy mix of countries, and we have to work with you and transport sector to decarbonize the sector. Just a word also on air quality. I didn't hear something on air quality. Working in air quality, we have also health people around the table. Air quality is a stake, we all know that. And basically speaking, fighting against air pollution is also fighting against climate change. So don't forget air quality in our transport project, measuring the impacts, supporting on partners. And last words, I would say that what we have today is to implement and finance projects with all these components to mobilize again soft money, not only to prepare and to program, but to implement and to support our partners to implement the project. Very often we have great studies and then we have to implement, and our partners need support. And the last word is, let us all advocate, and your report is a very good tool for that. Let us advocate for transport sector to some entities like GCF, like GEF. We all know that transport, it's often a little bit more difficult for transport than for other sectors to advocate and to get this consumption money from GCF, right? So let us be all together to convince GCF, more and more EU provide soft money and concession money to help this decarbonization of the sector, I would say. And thanks.
Great. That's a fantastic list. And I think building on that list, the TCC GSR next time will be even bigger than it was this year, picking up on some of those trends, because you're absolutely right. It's the interwoven impact of all of these things and these different elements and how they work together for improving both the climate impact of transport, but also those other health, social justice and equity issues as well. Thank you very much. Can I come to you, Carolina, and have your reflections on the trends in the report and the what you see as the key actions for priority? We've heard very much about its intersectorality, but also the regional differences. Where's your money going in this? If you had all that money that we need, where's your money going in this challenge?
Thank you, Bronwen, for your introduction, and let me thank also the whole SLOCAT team for inviting me here. And I want to echo on the congratulations to the team and all the contributors, because I think this kind of report actually, it's a really nice way to synthesize all the information that it's out there, and it's a key stone to get this information for all the actions and planning and evaluations that we do and from all the places that, I mean, from each role that we have in this ecosystem. So I just want to mention a couple of things. I think the report makes a good point in highlighting not only the general trends over the past years, but also what happened with COVID and how that impacted transit and transport systems. So maybe looking into the future, I think there is a huge opportunity to take some of the strategies that have been needed during the COVID time, such as, for example, demand management. I mean, many cities and operators had to put some limitations in how to use the transit and how much demand was allowed to make use of the services. And I think that's something that we already knew. We all talked about demand management in the past. And I think in this past year, we got a lot of experience in using different tools and strategies. The second one, I think it's active mobility. We've seen a lot of cities actually starting to promote cycling and allowing more pedestrian area in the cities in a way that we could avoid use the transport systems and reduce the exposure to this disease. So basically, I think those are really good strategies, and many cities such as in Bogota, even in Buenos Aires, in Mexico, I think a lot of cities have already, at least in Latin America, which is what I've seen most, they tested, piloted, they put bike lanes in a temporary way, and now they are there for staying. Not all of them, of course, because it's a testing and piloting experience all the time, and readjusting those plans. It's part of the job, right? And the third one, maybe it's this idea of the rethinking the public space. Most of the time we tend to think more about the technological upgrade of transit and vehicles, but then we had a strong push to use our public space in a different way, and not only for active mobility, but also allowing different activities to happen in the public space. And I think that's a good way to think how we can start avoiding unnecessary trips when we start having all the things in the proximity of our main activities, our residency. So these ideas that we heard about maybe 5 or 10 years ago about the 15 minutes cities, now they got really strength for many of the governments, and especially local governments, to rethink and re-engineer our spaces, especially with some trends in home office and remote jobs. And now we can start picking up that and see how these dynamics are going to change in the future and taking advantage from that.
Great.
I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
No, I think you've touched on some really lovely, additional elements, and that's what's really nice here is that we're picking up on some of these threads. Thanks, Carolina. I'd like to go now to Madan. I'm interested. We saw that the greatest increase in emissions is in the Asian region. We saw that the greatest increase in car ownership, and yet in many of those regions, people are already living in dense neighborhoods that enable like a 15-minute city concept that we're hearing from, and I'm using that as my little segue to invite you to talk through your priorities, perhaps with some of that regional focus. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think firstly, thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I think it's really a very good report, as I have been advocating since the last report. And then it's good to see, I think, some of the new focus areas, just like the gender and transport. That's really the new thing. And then even I think you try to cover the informal transport, and then those things I think is the additional bit. Yeah. And then it's really the rich resource material, and then I think, and it has to use for the advocacy this thing. And you're right. I think in the Asian context, I think there has been not much movement on the urban mobility. I think that's the priority. I think I was quite impressed to see. I think that because there is a much focus on the mass transit system, but heavy rail as well as the light rail. But I don't know why. I think that the BRT, I think just there was one BRT was made last year. But yeah, I quite agree with you. I think because of this COVID-19 and then active mobility actually allowed for the maintaining social distance, and then you choose a walk. And there is a lot of thing on that one. And then even though earlier also we said that the non-motorized transport is part of the the transport, and it has to be integrated with all the public transport system. And then basically we have to increase the facility for those type of things. And the last year actually I was quite impressed with the facility in Brisbane. Actually you really people walk there. You have a garden and parks all interconnected, all the facility of those. I think you just need. I think that these are, I would say, these are really the low cost mobility option. You need to provide those on the cities and interconnecting park and greenery. I think that's the priority area. And the second thing, another aspect I will talk about is I think many people said already on the electric mobility. And there is much push on the two-wheeler and electrifying two-wheeler, three-wheeler, and personal car. But we need to make a big jump. I think we need to go on the electrifying the public transport actually. And China has done a lot of great things. I think 4 or 5 cities they have almost 100% electric mobility, on the public transport. Actually, we just really now started about the escalating electric mobility in the public transport, and we are piloting in 4 or 5 countries. And then when we talk about these type of policy, because information and knowledge is a lot there, basically the challenge is to make those in the practice. And another important issue I'll bring in is that the governance and then ministerial intersectoral collaboration, just like the transport alone cannot do. I think you need to collaborate with the energy sector. And then because we are talking about the phasing out the fossil fuel vehicles, then you have to integrate it how the industry will do the manufacturing. So that is, I think, within the governance and also policy coordination, that's the real key. And then in the Asia Pacific region, we are really advocating on this type of public transport, active mobility, electric mobility. And then another important, I think somebody already talked about the freight. And then that's the way to go. I think the freight, long haul freight, I think it is an electric and the train. And you have seen growth in China, high speed train and those type of things. And but the question is how we facilitate and then intermodal transport type of thing. And we at ISCAP, at the Asia Pacific, we are having a ministerial conference in the December. And then the transport minister will be looking at the next 5-year action plan. actually, as earlier someone said, I think we are trying to focus more on the, not only on the economic development from the transport, social and environmental dimension, focusing on those type of things, and we really put an action-oriented agenda and advocating them to take the action, because what we know, all the knowledge is there, we know what to do. We talk of electric mobility, public transport, everything is there, but basically we need action, and then coordination at the federal level and then state level, as well as the somebody already mentioned about the local level, also at the city level. So these are all the things, and the active mobility, I think I'm for it actually. Whenever there is a thing, I really walk. I like walking. Thank you very much. I think if there is any other thing I need to add, I'll be happy to do that. Thank you. Thank you for this good info.
Thank you, Madan. That is comprehensive as well. And you mentioned my hometown, Brisbane, and that.
I didn't know that. I didn't know
that. So that was quite funny when I think about. I left Brisbane so that I could work on walking, and it has definitely in the last 20 years massively improved their town centre. So that's lovely. You also mentioned about two-wheelers, and one of the things that I found in this report was interesting was it broached the issue of SUVs and really touching on some of those new ideas that are coming through. It's come through with the different people. So perhaps I'm going to use the SUV segue to go to the car manufacturing companies in our midst, and that's a flag for you, Friedel, to share your thoughts from Germany about where you see with the key trends and the opportunities to take priority action from this report. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm with GIZ, and sustainability is the core business of GIZ, especially in the transport sector where I work. And the SLOCAT Transport and Climate Change report certainly makes this business easier for us because it has all the knowledge in one place. Because I think there's not a lack of know-how on transport and climate change, but now it is all in one place. So our work as a knowledge broker for sustainable transport and transport decarbonization is eased with such a product because we can use it as a reference point to show what the regional trends are. All the country fact sheets that are also included in the report are super helpful to show where are different countries at the moment and where are they going, what are good practice examples and lessons learned. All these informations, our projects, our advisors who cooperate directly with the policymakers around the world, they can use this know-how for their work in raising awareness, in setting agendas, in developing ideas together with the policymakers on what they can do. In terms of the priorities, of course, I cannot pick out one transport subsector because change needs to happen everywhere. But I would say that probably until the next edition of the GSR report comes out, the green recovery will be a priority. So we need to focus on actions that have a strong double dividend on emission reduction, but also for the socio-economic recovery. So actions that can improve people's living conditions, create jobs, and economic development. And the second priority I would see is in actions that can break the carbon lock-in. So I think the report often talks about the need for radical and bold action. So we need to plan the transportation infrastructure in a way that is low carbon. So the 15-minute city has been mentioned, but also we need to plan for integrated multimodal mobility infrastructure and stop investing in those high carbon or carbon intensive infrastructures. These would be the two priorities I would see, and I stop here and hand over back to you, Bronwyn.
Thank you, Friedel. That's really, I think you capture that, this resource that is this report in terms of everyone always wants numbers and understanding. And I know for walking, we've found some fantastic numbers in there. And for every industry, there's a challenge for that sector or that region, as well as a foundation on which to build their vision and their plan forwards. And one of the things that I'm hearing coming through is a lot around good governance. And I think a report like this, as well as the tracker that SLOCAT has done, and with the NDCs and all these different elements, we're starting to build in accountability as well as actions. And I'm looking forward over the next few years of when people realize that they're appearing in country fact sheets and they're appearing in databases like this and readily available data on a global comparison, that it builds a sense of responsibility and accountability between countries. So I like the threads that we're getting from our different speakers. Tali, let me come to you. You spoke already and you're very involved in the data of this report and shared some thoughts with us already. But in terms of some of those next immediate actions, what do you see as key for transport and climate change and building on the work that's been done in this report?
Sure, thanks, Bronwyn. And I'll keep it short so we can have a time for questions, because I think a lot of the speakers really covered it. Just two things I think from my side. One thing that came up in the report, which is quite interesting, is on urbanization and what it really means when somebody moves into a city from an energy use point of view, energy efficiency point of view. And there's this interesting moment where a city goes from being a social reactor, becomes something efficient, something useful, there's a reason to be in the city, there are jobs, to a sprawling trap. And I think when we talk, I think Carolina mentioned this about what is the space for, how do we think about land use? There's this expression about judging a society by its prisoners. I would suggest maybe we can judge cities by how children get around, for example. Just seeing it from a different perspective, I think is really important. And I think the report does a really good job, and that may sound surprising, but it does a good job of, let's say, providing the numeric basis for other stakeholders to get involved. So I would encourage us to think in different ways. The second thing is, the bad news is transport continues to be a bit of the black sheep. And from a climate finance point of view, until I think just a few days ago, I would have said there's one transport project with GCF. There are now two, so that's something. But I will say it might not be no wonder, because there's a lot of stakeholders involved, which can be a good thing. But as we all know on this call, that also means there's a lot of complexity. So I'll stop there on the bad news. Let's talk about good news. What can we do about it? And I think you mentioned the proliferation of sustainable urban mobility plans and national urban mobility plans. I think these are really interesting tools to get people together, from urban planning, even energy. There's one in Uruguay, for example, which works in electric mobility. So there's a lot of interesting ways these kind of structures can help us gather stakeholders together. There's also value chain analysis, which is another tool to consider. And I bring that up because some of the most exciting, let's say, electric 2- and 3-wheeler business models in the world are coming out of East Africa. And I think that might come to surprise to many, but that has a lot to do with that. The value chain, a lot of it can be done locally. And this is an opportunity to what Friedel pointed out about double dividends. This is something that really pulls it all together. But I think the way to get there is better interaction from the outset. To do this kind of cross-sectoral interaction as an afterthought never really works out very well. So I think it's it's up to us to try to do this well from the beginning. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Tali. And I invite everyone who's participating to, we have got time for questions in just a couple of minutes, but I'm going to so while I give my speakers just a last observation or comment, please also drop some questions into the chat so that we can bring them to the speakers. And I would really like to come back, if you don't all have to speak again, but if you've got something that's really come across, I think we've got a lot of urban professionals in the space. We did still fail to talk very much about shipping or aviation, and perhaps that's because it's not SLOCAT's core agenda. But I think if nothing, COVID did show us that we can have an impact on travel demand management, and we need to on the airline industry in particular. And we do need to start tackling some of those things. This report highlights the need for that. But I appreciate the diversity of the discussion here today. And I'd like just some last observations from you all, if you've got something to say, in particular about any immediate impact on your work or how you might take this forward. And Madan, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add on that, because you said that you are from Brisbane. I like basically the integration of the public transport there very much. Huh? And you have the water transport there, and you have those scooter also, free scooter available, and then walking. I think excellent walking. I have almost walked every corner of Brisbane on foot, you can really walk there. So that was the thing. And then so good the water transport system also kept, and the integration. I think you take one car and then you go on hop on it everywhere. Actually, I live in Bangkok, where actually they are talking for last 5 years for the fare integration, and they have 4 or 5 different systems. They have water. I was actually thinking to write about how you replicate those models. So you don't have to go other to do the fantasy research to see. There are the places who are already doing good, and you just take those things there and apply those. So that I was quite impressed that you said you are from Brisbane, and I don't know why I like Brisbane so much, and because of the public transport basically. So that's what I stress, the integration. Actually, we have talking so much of the you need to prioritize the NMT, and then you see and all the literature and all the research, and they're coming very strongly in this report also. I think now the idea of the 15-minute city because of the COVID, you say, and then actually and then people actually try not to very hesitant to use the public transport still, even the COVID different phase. So that's the way to go. You integrate, you provide the facility, and then try to give the how they will come forward. I think that will really take a lot of carbon off the off the hook. Actually, thank you.
Great. Thank you. And I think it's the critical factor that we have the case studies, not just the numbers in this report, so people can explore more behind the experiences and impacts of the activities that generate the numbers that we get. Holger, over to you.
Just as 2 other observations, I think the report also shows us what kind of the wealth of numbers we already have, but also the numbers we don't have. And I see here 3 big, huge gaps also we need also to fill in the future. I believe we need a different transport economic narrative. So transport actually creates a lot of jobs, and it's always about electric vehicles. We will use we will also reduce the jobs here. We need also to really we don't even know how many people work there, how many people work on public transport, how many people work in the informal sector. So here you have some generic numbers also on the ILO, but that's far not enough. So we can actually, I believe also we can also create far stronger narrative around jobs and also the economy. And that is for me also the second element where I feel, again, we spoke a little bit about freight, but let's talk more about freight. Let's talk about also how this relates in fact also to also the most vulnerable economies when we talk about Asia and Africa. They need also roads. Let's also be honest also about that, but also see also how we can actually really also create also that pathway for these countries which also need the economic growth, needs also some road extension. And with that also, how much rail can we actually provide in the next 20 years? And let's be also more serious about that. So I would say far stronger. Let's talk about jobs. Let's talk about also the economy also in that context. And the report already highlights also what is actually needed here. Thank you.
I think that's a really good point, because when you look at continents like Africa, they don't have the carbon, like the climate motivation to actually invest in sustainable transport. But if you build it into the whole package and the whole value chain as such, then you have a different starting point for those countries to make those choices. Carolina.
Thank you. Actually, these are all great points, and I want to highlight that I think this report strengthens the arguments that we already have for working in each of the regions. Like having information and demonstrating how important it is to actually work in with an integral approach of how to reduce the emissions and the impacts of the transport sector, as we all say in different ways. I mean, there is no transport decarbonization strategy that does not linkage to economic strategies, to the planning agencies, to the energy sector. So I think there are good experiences already in the region, as some of them have been mentioned. I always remember Uruguay, transport strategies aligned to their climate action plans and the energy policy. So I think taking into those experiences and trying to promote more of the peer learning among the cities and the countries other examples how cities could start incorporating in their local plans the urban logistics and freight in their cities, which is something that is always neglected. We always think about passenger transport in our cities, and I think starting to acknowledge those things, using this report to show that information, help us to work better in creating these peer learning spaces, in strengthening the dialogue and assisting, providing support to the countries and the cities in each region.
And actually, Carolina, we have a question now, going to some of the questions from the floor. From Rafael. In Brazil, the COVID crisis created the urgency of debating a national plan, as Tali said, and changing the regulation of the transport sector. And funding obviously is key, but what he would like to know, is there any work comparing best practices in national regulation of urban transport and mobility? Is that, I mean, that you're still there, Carolina, but if someone else wants to pick it up around the national regulations of urban transport, that often fraught relationship between government levels.
I personally don't know that many comparisons, but I do know that in Latin America are fewer countries that do have already fully developed their national plans. So I think once we start getting and promoting this and picking up on those experiences, we might start learning from what are the best strategies and what tools could be used for developing these plans. We already mentioned the SAMs and NAMs with the European methodology that it's spreading out in Latin America. So I think that's going to bring a lot of information on how to start helping others to develop their own plans.
Great. Anyone else to pick that up? Otherwise, Klaus is asking about carbon lock-in. Was that you, Friedel, who used that expression? Or yes. And I don't know if you can see the question in the chat. It's quite long, but it asks a lot about international travel and seat capacities, airport infrastructure. With increasing needs and wants for global cooperation, will we achieve this? Can you see, did you see that there? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you have a remark? Thanks, Friedel.
Well, actually, I read on the news today that in Germany, there's a resurgence of business trips, business travel. So flights are picking up again, but also train trips are picking up again. So more and more companies, at least in Germany, probably across Europe, are becoming more climate conscious and asking their employees to, if they travel somewhere, to use the train, especially since we have the European Year of the Rail, and more and more long distance, also cross-border trains are in the planning or are being put up again as they existed before. So I'm optimistic when it comes to traveling by train across Europe. I think in other geographies where the rail infrastructure is still in the development, that might take a bit more time. And of course, it only works in continental areas. But it is certainly a trend that we will see growing over the next years, and where I think GIZ will also have a closer look at, and in its dialogue with partners and donors, we'll look to have more projects in the future in the area of rail.
Great, great. I think that is our time, unless any of my panelists have a last remark. There's been some great questions in the chat, and I know that we're all aware of the challenge that faces us as a community, and we've identified all the other players in the ecosystem that we need to bring to bear into the mix as well. But I think there's some clear flags there, and thank you very much for participating. Thank you for your contribution to the report and support to SLOCAT. And I pass back now to Maruxa to close the webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Roman.
Thank you so very much, Bronwyn, Holger, Carolina, Stefan, Friedel, Tali. Thanks for all the support for all the months and you know, for being here with us today for this very thought-provoking conversation. Much appreciated. We're looking forward to what comes in the next months, isn't it? So yeah, it's time to wrap up. The conversation doesn't stop here, though. We certainly would like to continue the conversation with all of you and beyond. As you can see, the report really underscores that urgent need for local, national, and global action towards sustainable low-carbon transport, and with a focus on the trends that we've seen in 2019 and 2020. It is actually telling us that we can reduce the emissions while ensuring the economic prosperity is still there. The point that Holger was making about making sure that countries can keep developing and the right transport infrastructure is put in place. In order to achieve that, what we really need is that type of radical action, isn't it? To ensure that the right decision and the right investments, the right public policies are being put in place. And we have a bit of an opportunity right now to create that lasting, long-lasting opportunity for people and planet. I cannot really close this workshop, this webinar, without making a bit of a call to action on data for all of this. We know that we need to keep on nourishing some data gaps. We know that data on policy and on investment is essential really for decision making. And we know to what extent there's more and more stakeholders that are contributing to that collection on policy and on data points, but we still face gaps, critical gaps across different transport modes and critical gaps in different regions. So if like us, you believe in really this imperative of open source knowledge and data, just reach out and help us continue to nourish these databases that then give birth to this type of a community and collective knowledge efforts that we put at the service of all our movement. And stay tuned for upcoming announcements. In a few weeks, we will be having a webinar session in French and in Spanish. We're really trying to honor the very strong regional dimension of the report and the very global nature of our partnership and of these topics that we're of course talking about here. By all means, please help us amplify the findings of the report and help us build the conversations around those findings. Help us indeed use this report and its outcomes as a knowledge base for those advocacy efforts that are still very needed, whether it is on the transport economics, whether it is on connecting with other communities, on urban development, on health, on behavioral change, on renewables. This is really the effort that is ahead of all of us in this very critical juncture of the recovery packages. And by all means, reach out to us with recommendations, constructive criticisms, critiques about this report, because the thinking towards the third edition of the SLOCAT Transport and Climate Change Global Status Report is starting very soon, certainly before the end of this year. And we want to make sure that this is a useful resource to our community, given the effort and the amount of people that are behind it. So huge thanks again to all the friends and colleagues who have actually contributed to make this report possible in different ways. A big thanks, of course, to my team colleagues in the SLOCAT Secretariat who have been pulling a lot of the weight here, absolutely. And thanks to all of you. Please stay connected, stay tuned, and check out that link that is being shared with you now in the chat for an evaluation form about this webinar. We would really like to learn how to make it more interesting for you and what would you like to see in next day editions of a discussion webinar. Take a moment, please, to answer those few questions, and we will be sending all this information, of course, via email shortly after this webinar. So that's all for now. Thank you so very much. Stay safe and see you around. Thank you. Bye-bye.